Welcome to today's third and final session, which is planning for a high-quality evaluation of professional learning, session 3, which is using evaluation information and working with evaluators. Today's presenters, myself, Katrina Bledsoe, and I'm a research scientist and evaluation specialist at Education Development Center here in Washington, D.C., and I'm going to let Candice, my colleague, introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. This is Candice Bocala. I am with WestEd. We are a partner on the REL Northeast Islands, and I co-facilitate the Professional Learning and Development Alliance, which is sponsoring this webinar series.
Thanks, Candice. So as we've mentioned, at this Professional Learning and Development Alliance, the purpose of the alliance is to support district leaders from the Northeast region to make evidence-based decisions regarding the selection, adaptation, scale-up, and discontinuation of professional learning and development programs and interventions. So we're here to try to provide information about that's specifically related to professional development initiatives and how they fit into their needs. In short, we want you to think about how to enhance your capacity to work with evaluators and or to think about how you can evaluate your programs more effectively. So that's that's the role for today. This is, as we've mentioned before, the third of 3 in a series about planning for high-quality evaluations of professional learning. So in session 1, we covered establishing the purpose of evaluation, and that was in October, and some of you might have been able to join us for that. In session 2, we looked at understanding data in the evaluation planning process, and that was in November. And then this final one, of course, is focusing on using evaluation information and working with evaluators. So that's what we'll be talking about. And today's agenda, as Ashley mentioned earlier, for those of you who were in the lobby, we are going to cover an introduction and review of the last session. Also, we're going to move on to talking to data analysis and data reporting. Finally, we're going to move on to evaluation dissemination and use and the logistics and planning for an evaluation. And then we'll talk about conclusions and next steps, particularly since this is our third webinar, and how you can continue on your continued learning. So today, what we'll be doing is we're going to consider how to interpret different claims from data analysis. So sort of thinking about how you're going to be able to evaluate different claims and how they look from when you're doing different types of analyses on them. And then understand the importance of dissemination efforts to foster evaluation use, so thinking about how you disseminate. And then also become familiar with the logistics involved in conducting an evaluation and working with external evaluators, which we know many of you have already done. So I'm going to turn it over, actually, to Candice, who's going to do a review of sessions 1 and 2.
Thank you. So we know that not everybody was able to join us, so we just wanted to set a common foundation going through some of the things we talked about in sessions 1 and 2. This includes introducing this idea of continuous evaluation, and we introduced this model, which has 5 steps. And in sessions 1 and 2, we really worked through steps 1, 2, and 3 in more detail. So if you download the slide presentation from today, from the Download Today's Files box, at the end of the slides for today, there will be some links to the webinar recordings from those first 2 sessions, if you'd like to go back and review them at a later time. But we want to emphasize that we're using this cycle of continuous evaluation. We started out with really defining a program, thinking about logic modeling, followed by deriving evaluation questions, and thinking about possible data sources. So today we'll be really focusing on steps 4 and 5. As you look at this model, we also want to get a little bit of sense from you all what your work has been in evaluation, maybe as a participant in an evaluation or somebody who has conducted an evaluation. We'd like you to answer in this chat box that has appeared below the slides now, which step in this model is most difficult for you and why? Why would it be hard, for example, to think about implementing data collection? Or why is it hard to think about defining the program? So take a moment and just think which step of this model might be the most difficult or has been the most difficult for your work, and why would that be? While you're thinking, I see that some people are typing. I'll just read through the different steps. The first one is define. What is the purpose of the evaluation and the underlying logic of the program? Step 2 would be plan. What questions should the evaluation answer and using what design? Step 3 would be implement. How should data be collected and analyzed? Step 4 is interpret. What are the results and how should results be communicated? And step 5 is inform or refine. What decisions can be made about the program and how will you support others to use these results? So which steps are difficult and why? We can bring your answers into some of our commentary later on, or it's just helpful to hear a little bit about your context. Thanks, Kim. Kim is saying that it's a combination of steps 1 and 3 because sometimes it's difficult to measure impact and difficult to get the information you need from others. So I appreciate the connection between steps 1 and 3 because step 1 is about defining your program, which includes trying to figure out what impact do you expect to have and how would you measure that. And then step 3 is the data collection piece. Sometimes it is hard to get all of the data from the right people in a timely manner. And then another comment about step 5, because there isn't the funding or political will to make necessary changes yet. Sometimes you can conduct an evaluation and you can have some results, but it's difficult to get the right people to use those results. We'll actually talk about that today since we'll be going over step 5. And then one more comment, defining is the hardest part of the process. People want to have a plan immediately, but taking the time to adequately define the purpose and developing logic models makes the rest of the steps easier, but some clients don't want to take that time. That's definitely been my experience as well, that people want to jump right into collecting data, but if you don't really know what the program is trying to do and what outcomes you're trying to measure, it certainly can get harder because then we might be collecting data we don't need, or we might be forgetting about data because we haven't taken the time to think about which outcomes we want most. So I know other people are typing into the chat. We're going to move along, and if you want to type into the general chat, this chat box is going to go away, but we can still hear from you in that chat box over to the left-hand side about which step is most difficult for you and why. I want to remind everybody who's been joining us over the past couple of sessions, we've been using an example of a real professional learning program as a way to kind of ground our conversation in something concrete. So the STEM Partnership Program, that's a pseudonym for a real program here in the Northeast, and it is a professional learning program, professional development program, where teachers receive professional development from local universities focused on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, so STEM, and they also receive support with inquiry-based lesson planning. As a part of this partnership, the university faculty and the students at the university, the graduate students, are mentors throughout the year for local middle and high school students to try to get the students interested in STEM, pursuing STEM later in their lives. And these teachers and university participants form a professional learning community, or a PLC, to meet together during the year to discuss STEM education. And students also gain access to university research facilities and other learning opportunities such as after-school programming as a result of this partnership. So this is really a partnership that happens across multiple levels in this district to benefit teachers' professional learning in science, technology, and math, as well as students' learning. And if you were with us from a previous session, you'll know that we developed a logic model for this program, and it includes all the components that you would normally see in a logic model. You can download this by going to the handouts and download today's file so you can follow along with the scenario and the logic model as we go. One of the things to remember that we covered in the previous session is that it's important that steps 1 through 3 are very closely connected to the logic model. So we really derived our evaluation questions by going to the logic model and trying to see what are the outcomes that this program is trying to produce. And starting with that outcome, you can think of an evaluation question that's aligned to that outcome, followed by an aligned way to study that question. That's what we call study design, and then think about some data sources that might match that study design. So we're not going to repeat that point here other than to say it's really important to have alignment. Back to the logic model, as one of our participants said, all along the way as you consider your evaluation planning. The other thing that we covered in a previous session that's going to be useful here is the difference between qualitative and quantitative data. So each source of data has its own advantages and disadvantages. Generally, qualitative data come from talking to participants or written observations, and quantitative data are those numeric counts or scores that you can analyze using statistics. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go into data analysis in this section. So I'll pause here, and Katrina will pick up with step 4.
Thanks, Candice. So in step 4 now, we're talking about interpreting data. So it's understanding and communicating data results. So let's go back to our continuous evaluation model just to sort of show you exactly where that is on the model. And step 4 really talks about dealing with what are the results and how should those results be communicated. So in step 4, the evaluation team often will determine the main takeaways, or what we often call findings from the evaluation. We're not going to go in this case into all the ways that you can analyze the data today, but if you work with a knowledgeable evaluator or a researcher or consultant, they will be informed about the quantitative and qualitative methods that you can use to analyze your data. So in this section, as we start going through this, we're hoping that you understand the difference between data and data analysis, and the analysis of data, the different choices to make about conducting analysis, including seeking analytical frameworks that move beyond simply reporting on data to thinking more how it's going to work or what it looks like conceptually for the program. And then hopefully that you'll understand to increase capacity to make demands of evaluators that you ask to work with you regarding the kinds of questions to ask. So in step 4, and we also have a handout on which you can see in the corner about the evaluation planning template. In step 4, there are a few guiding questions. One, which is what are the results, and in that question, we're talking about what are the limitation of those results. So not just about what the results are, but what are the limitations of what you find, and then also how the results should be communicated. Meaning, what level of involvement are you expecting from the audience when you present those results? And what activities can you conduct to support the audience in sort of making sense of the findings? And when you get an opportunity to read through the guiding questions and also refer to the handout that we have, which is the evaluation planning template, which has some of the steps in the guiding questions that you can use at a later reference. But we're not going to ask you to do anything with the handout today. We just wanted to sort of provide that as a tool that you can use to be able to think that through a little bit. So we're talking a little bit about what are the results. When we talk about what are the results, there's a couple of things, as we mentioned, that we want you to take away with today, which is the data collection versus data analysis. When we talk about analyzing data, it goes simply beyond just reporting the data that you have. You're also thinking about trying to answer the evaluation questions that you've asked, and using the data, using an analytic framework, the other ways to make other ways to make sense of the data and make multiple conceptualizations of the data, and then also to use that data to inform decision making. And in a lot of instances, the evaluation questions, of course, should drive the analysis of the data, and in some cases, you might find that sometimes people use the methodology to drive the analysis of the data, and it shouldn't. It really should be about the evaluation questions. So you're trying to use the data to frame the answers of those questions, and you might apply a framework or some way to interpret all the data that you've been able to get. And again, you're also looking to really draw conclusions. So once you have the data, either survey results or interview notes or numeric data, like test results, you really want to have a method to apply to summarize that data And the method that you use varies by whether you have quantitative data, which might be from testing or numeric counts of something or tracking data, or qualitative data that you might have gotten from focus groups or interviews or open-ended questions or listening sessions. So there are a couple of examples we wanted to sort of give you, an idea of how those questions might be analyzed. So we have two. One is a little bit more quantitative and one is qualitative. So the first one that we're looking at, which is what are the characteristics of participants in the STEM partnership, and do these characteristics influence the amount of participation? So that's the quantitative question that we're asking. And the study design is much more descriptive. So you're asking, when we say descriptive, we're talking about, well, what are the characteristics? Who might they actually be? And it might include demographic data. And then, of course, the data type that you're going to be getting might be frequencies, counts, numerics. And then when you're looking at the analysis of this kind of data, you're looking at the displaying counts or percentages, and you've seen them often in tables, or you might see them in histograms for each group and how often they participated. So a lot of times when people ask for descriptive data or demographic data, they're actually asking you for quantitative data, and those data are based on looking at characteristics and describing how things are. The second type of question that we have here is what motivates stakeholders to participate in the STEM partnership? Now, the study design is exploratory, meaning that we're trying to get a sense of what all might be the issues that people might be motivated to actually participate. So the design is much more exploratory because we're not necessarily saying that anybody has a particular way of doing things. We're trying to figure out exactly what all people might be doing and the different ways they might be doing it. So the data type, qualitative. And the way we analyze it would be summarizing main themes and categories using representative quotations. So in this case, and you've seen them in a lot of instances, where you get actual quotes from people and finding out that there may be a running theme of how people are reacting to their participation in STEM partnerships. So those are a couple of examples of the questions and analyses, both quantitative and qualitative, that you can kind of think through. So let's go a little bit deeper in some of that quantitative data analysis. So as I mentioned before, common data analysis or common methods in quantitative data usually is tables where you see counts, percentages, averages, and then charts and graphs usually, and then statistical methods such as correlations, regressions. You'll hear the randomized controlled trial experiment is also another way. And quantitative data is numerical in nature, of course. And an example might be something like, what might be the number of staff who participated in professional learning. And then also it might be the percentage of teachers who say they've changed their teaching methods due to professional learning. The benefits of quantitative data can tell you the what, which is sort of like a descriptive picture of the current state of something, which I mentioned before. It can be used to draw causal inferences. So quantitative data, you can draw causal inferences in if using experimental designs like a randomized controlled trial. And it can denote differences between groups. So you can tell the differences between groups in the way that they score. And some of the limitations of this, and we know that a lot of instances people tend to rely on quantitative data quite a bit, but some of the limitations is it doesn't always tell you what is happening in each specific case. It doesn't tell you sort of like, well, what's underneath all of that. And sometimes you can run into problems generalizing if you don't quite have the right study design, or you don't have the large sample size or the right number of participants. It can get a little bit tricky on trying to make causal inferences, and it can also give you some pause into providing an opportunity and an answer as to why it might be that way. On the other hand, qualitative data, and we know that these are often used as well, which is the thematic are using common analysis methods. You may hear people talk about thematic summaries with quotations, or they have code counts where they count the numbers of similar responses. And often they may try to sort of extrapolate a little bit more based on some of the summaries and quotations. But the benefits are that they can tell you the how and the why participants reacted to a certain reason, to a certain aspect or a certain program or professional learning development opportunity. And it can also talk about detailed descriptions, provide actual quotes and illustrations, and it can give you a general sense of some of the emotions behind some of those numerics. The limitations on this, of course, is the data take longer to analyze and can require more resources, and excuse me, in a lot of instances, it can be a little bit more expensive to do that because it is a little bit more time consuming. And then it also is considered more subjective because you're using an interpretive lens to select participants' words in a lot of instances. So, and the person who is doing that analysis using their best judgment, they often try to select representative quotations, and that's definitely a judgment call. So you really have to be clear about why you're selecting certain quotations and not others, and trying to keep that in mind. And then while quantitative data might seem more objective because you're presenting numbers, there's still some interpretation actually in that aspect as well, because you have to decide which data analytic methods to use and how to present and report the numeric data. So both of these, I know a lot of folks like to make the distinction between that they seem, quantitative data seems a little bit more subjective, but you also have to take into consideration, qualitative data seems more subjective, but you have to take into consideration with quantitative data that often the methods that we choose and sometimes the questions that we choose to ask can also be subjective. So I'm going to turn it over to Candice.
Yes, thank you. So another way you can think about analysis, in addition to how do I summarize the data, is can I compare this data to a known framework or a set of quality criteria that are important in helping me make meaning of this data? So one of the most popular or common set of standards for professional learning are the professional learning standards from Learning Forward. They're a professional organization for practitioners interested in designing and providing high-quality professional development, and they have 7 professional learning standards that are roughly organized under these topic headers in the purple box on the right-hand side. And so you might ask yourself, is this STEM partnership professional development program, does it meet the characteristics of high-quality professional learning? That's a reasonable question to ask in an evaluation. So in order to decide whether it does, you need to define what is high quality in this case. And so by using standards, you can better have a set of definitions and examples that can help you make that decision. So let's walk through an example together. One of the standards for professional learning is about resources, and it is professional learning that increases educator effectiveness and results for all students, requires prioritizing, monitoring, and coordinating resources for educator learning. So when we think about resources, those might be teachers' time, that might be funding, that might be other technical resources, technology, equipment. In this case of the STEM partnership, it's probably lab equipment and other science and technology equipment that the teachers use. So you might think to yourself, did schools have sufficient resources to participate in this partnership program? That might be an evaluation question that you would like to answer. So in order to study this, you might propose a descriptive study. You just want to understand and maybe catalog all of these different resources or lack of resources. So you might use the data sources of a document review of the STEM partnership activities. You might interview teachers about which resources were provided to them, and you might interview the university faculty and university faculty and the community about which resources they provided to schools as part of this partnership. And in order to analyze the data, you might use a method like cost analysis, which is trying to understand the expenses associated with this partnership. How much did it cost? Did people think it was worth the cost? You might do a thematic summary of interviews with the most common resources provided and any challenges, and then use those quotations as Katrina talked about before. So that's one way to think about using a standard or a set of criteria to help you guide your analysis. Let's walk through a similar example with a different standard. This is the standard for leadership. So the Learning Forward standard here is professional learning for that increases educator effectiveness and results for all students requires skillful leaders who develop capacity, advocate, and create support systems for professional learning. So if you were involved with this program or you were evaluating this program, you might use the following evaluation question. How did school leaders support the work of the STEM partnership? So which types of data and analyses might be appropriate for this evaluation question? We're going to ask that to you in a poll. So if you look on your screen to the right-hand side, there's a poll with some different options. Choose which option you think might be an appropriate data collection and data analysis method for this particular Learning Forward standard and this question. And I'll read out the options on the poll. The first one is you could survey teachers about their overall satisfaction with the program and summarize the responses in tables. The next one is you could interview students about whether they are interested in STEM careers and select quotations to explain their most common answers. The third one is you could interview principals about how the STEM partnership fits with school goals and select quotations to explain their most common answers. And then the last one is you could survey teachers on whether they felt they had enough time, resources, and support from administration and summarize responses in tables. And you can select more than one answer here. And we're hiding your answers until we get a sense of everybody's responses, just so that you're not influenced by each other's answers. So it seems like quite a few people have selected their most popular choices. You can select more than one. And we'll go ahead and broadcast those results just so that everybody can see what are the most popular choices. So according to this data, it does seem like most people think that interviewing the principals as well as surveying teachers about resources that were provided to them and support from the administration seem to be the best way to try to gather and analyze data that's reflecting this question. It's not impossible that you could, survey teachers about their overall satisfaction and get some insight about this. So the first one, I think, is also viable. It's just more general. That first one is more about the teacher's overall satisfaction as opposed to trying to connecting it to leadership directly. And here we might be thinking about the leadership of the principal. The next one about interviewing students, that's even a little bit more indirect. It's harder to try to get at a sense of whether there was leadership support for this professional learning by interviewing students, especially if you're asking them about their careers. So that's the one that maybe isn't quite a good fit, but you never know. You could always make a case for it. So we'll move on to just a summary of some data analysis challenges. I'm just wrapping up this section. So the first one, and this is no surprise probably to many of you, is don't make claims that are not grounded in or do not come from your data. It's just a responsible way to be able to look at your data and then also just say what you see and not what you don't see or what you might, don't make interpretations that really don't have evidence. The second is to make some considerations when you are drawing your findings or drawing your results from the data. Those considerations have to do with limitations that Katrina talked about earlier. So the first one is sample size. Smaller samples don't always represent an entire population. There's representativeness of the sample. Sometimes participants choose to self-select into an evaluation, and so you might have certain groups represented but not others. For example, maybe only teachers were interviewed but not parents, which is another important group. You want to think about how the data were collected and whether or not that affected your evaluation results. You might want to know about the program's long-term effect on teachers, so you would need data collected over multiple points in time. You would want to think about how stakeholders were involved. Sometimes stakeholders being involved can help the data be seen as credible because it's informed by stakeholder perspectives. And last, there's a need to discern the difference between statistical significance, which is really important if you're doing a quantitative study, and practical significance, where you must take into account the cost of implementing something, resources and logistics. So something may be statistically significant, but you might not be able to reproduce it because it's way over cost in terms of the resources you have at hand. So that's just something else to consider as you are looking at your data. So we're going to go on and do a quick review of reporting results.
Great. Thanks, Candice. So we're talking a little bit about how should results be reported, and we figured there's three things that people really need to consider. One is trying to remember to connect to the evaluation questions. So keep in mind the following issues during step 4, the analysis piece is first is to remember the connection between the purpose for the evaluation and your evaluation questions. And if you get an opportunity, you should organize the data first to answer the research questions, keeping in mind why you were even interested in those questions. And then for example, a professional learning program like the STEM partnership, you might have been interested in whether partnering with the university STEM faculty help teachers plan better inquiry-based lessons. So, you know, as you examine your data, you want to be looking for whether teachers did have better lesson planning skills. And then also think about how they've been planning their lessons in the future, and maybe an analysis of the structure and the content of their lesson plan. So that would be a way to sort of keep making sure that you connect your evaluation questions to the results. The second piece is trying to report both positive and negative findings, and a lot of instances it's really tempting just to report the really positive findings because people are usually worried about something, that they might lose something or whatever. But the good and responsible evaluators really report both positive and negative findings, because sometimes negative findings can be sort of lessons learned or areas for improvement. It doesn't necessarily mean that something's going to end. And you want to report both what's going well and what the challenges are, and it can be helpful to frame negative or uncertain findings as lessons or lessons learned or areas for improvement, and it can even be a way to think about are resources needed in other areas that you hadn't thought about before. And then the third aspect is acknowledging limitations, trying to remember that the choice of the study design and you know, trying to make sure that people understand that the choice of the study design influences the claims you can make about the data. So you can't really make any claims that the design didn't allow you to. So for example, if you just did an exploratory study and you interviewed students about whether they enjoyed participating in the STEM partnership and what they learned about science, for instance, you can't really draw any conclusions about the program's impact on the students' test scores. That would need a causal study and more rigorous statistical methods just there. So you can only claim what the study design allows you to claim. So that's one of the things that you have to consider in reporting results. So after you've figured out, well, how are we going to report this and what do we want to report and what meaning do we want to make of it, we also want to determine the audience for reporting, who's going to be there. And we need to think about like how we're going to communicate them. We need to figure out who's going to be there and what information they want to know. So sometimes it helps to make a list of the audiences that you'll be communicating from and what information they'd like to know and what kind of background do those audiences have regarding the program. And you have to take into consideration with all those different audiences that some may have different bits of information that others may not. So you definitely have to tailor your reporting towards them. You have to think about how much time and interest will they have, and it might be that different stakeholders have different expectations about what they'll hear, and then also think about what they want to do with those results. Do people want to start something that's a little bit independent of what another group might do? And then are you going to involve stakeholders in the reporting? You can figure out if you're going to involve stakeholders in determining findings or having them create final reports or making final presentations to various audiences. So trying to figure out who's going to be there. It can require a lot of reporting to a lot of different folks, and it depends on who really has a stake in it and how they want to hear it and what best way they can hear it and actually make some movement and utilization on it. And then, of course, getting the message across. Really trying to think about how we're doing getting the messages across. Traditional reports, are you going to use a memo or a letter or a special newsletter or policy brief? It may be that phone calls work in some ways, or even a workshop or a blog. And again, that depends on the audience and how best they hear it, and also the language that they're willing to hear it in. Be sure to present information in a more action-oriented way, which focuses on what the reader will need to be able to actually utilize it and make movement. So we're going to give you an opportunity to sort of tell us a little bit about we know that you're actually going out there and talking to different folks. What are some of the most common ways that you report information to your stakeholders? So I see we have some coming up here. We have people who use a traditional report. Yes, that's very, very common. And then also, we also have folks who are talking about special newsletters and a presentation also, workshops. Great. And also just a reminder with the chat as well, getting reminded by Candice, that also tell us why you like using that report method. So if you've reported one that you really are using, why do you like using it? So if you can put that in the chat, that would be great. We see traditional reports running out, and then of course the presentation. Those are two standard ones. And then Laura actually says she uses different methods for different reports, for different purposes. Yeah, definitely. And I agree with Candice. I'd love to hear how people use the workshop to report evaluation results. I think that's a great way to do that because you're already people are already engaged. And the special newsletter or policy brief. That's always that is one that comes up quite often as well. And yeah, so it seems that still very traditional, which is not unexpected at all, that we use traditional reports and presentations before a board or committee, although some folks did mention that they use a workshop or a special newsletter, and would love to hear a little bit more about that if you ever get an opportunity to share with folks about how that is, because that's not usually done, but it is a way to really move things forward. And so thanks to everyone who had some comments. Any last comments on that? Great, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. So I'm going to turn it over to Candice, who's going to talk a little bit about step 5, our final step, inform or refine.
Yes, thank you. We did have a comment from Linda about face-to-face allowing for more engagement. So I wonder if that was related to my comment about wanting to hear from people who did workshops. I think that's one of those methods that it can be really engaging, and if you have a stakeholder group that has been participating with you all along the way, they may want to attend a workshop and maybe make sense of the findings with you and sort of look at the data. So I think that's really interesting. So thanks for pointing that out, Linda. So in step 5, which is the last step before we start to talk about some of the logistics of planning for evaluation at the end of our time today, step 5 is inform or refine. This is the decision that needs to get made from your evaluation results. So returning to our continuous evaluation model, the key questions in inform or refine are what decisions can be made about this program and how will you support others to use these results. We're going to talk a lot about evaluation use because the whole goal of evaluation is to do something differently, whether that is to continue the program, scale up the program, or in some cases maybe stop doing the program and maybe do something else instead. So just a reminder that there is a handout that we created to support you with this work. It's the handout number 2, which is the evaluation planning template. It has these questions in the template for you to use as you consider how to go about doing this for your own programs. So as we consider which decisions can be made, I've already mentioned a few of them, but a big part of why we would want to do evaluation is to improve the program. So before we've decided if we're making any high-stakes decisions, first we'd just like to use that information to get better at what we're doing. That's more common in formative evaluation and early evaluation. And then eventually, as you get toward the other end of the continuum in summative evaluation, you would be considering whether you would scale up the program, continue or close the program. And then there are other implications or uses of evaluation which might have to relate to policy or other ways that your districts or even states make decisions about professional learning. So sometimes evaluations can inform on that broader level how you're thinking about your professional learning strategy or how you're thinking about engaging teachers in this professional learning strategy. So another framework that we'd like to present to you today comes from Michael Quinn Patton. He's an evaluation scholar who thinks a lot about use and how people use the decisions from evaluations. He has a framework where he starts off with outlining a couple of forms of use. The first 2 are instrumental use, which are that evaluation findings directly inform decision-making or problem-solving. So for example, if the school decides on the basis of an evaluation to adopt a new curriculum or start a new professional learning strategy, that would be an example of instrumental use. A second example of use is conceptual use. This is influencing how key people think. So policymakers may understand an issue better after an evaluation, even though you may not see any direct actions. So in this case, for professional learning, if you were to study the STEM partnership and you were to discover that this really makes a difference in how well teachers plan their lessons in inquiry-based math and science, that may not lead to immediate changes, but it might start to influence the principals thinking about the program. It might start to influence the district leaders thinking about continuing to fund the program, which may eventually lead to that instrumental use. We also want to be cautious of 2 types of use, symbolic use and persuasive use. Symbolic use is when evaluation is conducted primarily for the sake of appearances. Somebody has mandated the evaluation or it's required in some kind of guidance, but the decision makers really don't have the intention of using the results to change anything. That is symbolic use. And then the last kind is persuasive use. So sometimes evaluations are done selectively or findings from evaluations are used selectively to support somebody's previously held position. This is the problem when people pick and choose which findings they want to support their case. In some cases, maybe the data actually support this position. That's not a problem because then you are reporting what is true, but people forget to also report maybe the negative findings or they forget to report the limitations because what you're trying to do is persuade people beyond what the data can tell you. So you want to be cautious of those 2 forms of use, even though they do happen. So what Michael Quinn Patton advocates for is this attention to utilization-focused evaluation. So we really need to think about the intended user and the communities that are targeted by these evaluations and use leadership in order to make use a part of the evaluation process, make decision-making part of the evaluation process, and not just have evaluation be a data collection task that's focused on reporting. So that is just something to take away. And if you'd like to learn more, you can read up on utilization-focused evaluation by Michael Quinn Patton, and we have a reference at the end of these slides. So when you think about use, as Katrina was saying earlier, you want to think about your audience or your stakeholders, people who actually have a stake in the evaluation. So you need to think about some questions, such as what decisions can be made as a result of these evaluations, who will make them and by when, how can we present the results in a way that those are used in a timely and influential way, and then what needs to be done in order to achieve the level of influence you want. So you might, for example, pay special attention way at the beginning of planning for an evaluation about which stakeholders to involve. If you know you need to make some changes, for example, to how principals are working with teachers around professional learning, you're going to want a stakeholder group full of principals who can tell you what they think about the program. And so another set of questions is how will stakeholders be involved in making those decisions? So not just considering from the beginning how they'll be part of the evaluation planning, but once the evaluation is over and once you actually have the data and findings, how will the stakeholders participate in discussing implications of those findings? Will they be able to use the findings for their own next steps? Maybe that's the advantage of a workshop, bringing people together to talk about implications, rather than the evaluator being the one to say, here's what I think you should do, having the stakeholders gather together and say, this is what we found, what do we think we should do? So just going back to our example, as we've been talking all along about the STEM partnership program, we're going to do a little bit more kind of interaction here. So if you imagine that an evaluation was done of the STEM partnership program, so the data are in and the findings are in and somebody has analyzed that data, and what we wanted to do with this evaluation is we wanted to decide whether to continue this program. We just wanted to make the decision, should we continue it or not continue it? What decisions could we make using this finding? So let's say we found that middle school girls who participated in the STEM partnership tend to choose more STEM courses in high school, but their enrollment in the program does not appear to relate to girls enrolling in STEM courses in higher education, so university or college education. What kinds of decisions might you make if you were a program leader in this case? What kinds of things might this lead you to think about? Or what kinds of things might this lead you to do? So if you were maybe a university person who's deciding whether or not to continue the partnership, if you were a district that was looking to scale up this partnership, maybe if you were a funder and you were looking for a place to put your money, if you wanted to encourage girls' participation in science, technology, and math, what kinds of decisions might be made using this finding? It's kind of a complicated one. So response here from Hella, follow-up qualitative study. Yeah, so that's really an interesting approach. It's not to make a decision just yet. It's to see what we can learn. Right? What more can we learn before we make a decision? Maybe figure out why middle school girls tend to increase their enrollment in high school, but maybe not in higher education. What are some other things that might happen if you had this finding and you were thinking about use? I know one consideration that often comes up is continue to participate or not continue to participate. You know, is it worth it to us as a district to continue in this program if we just get our middle school girls enrolling in STEM in high school? That might be good enough for us. Response here from Laura, interested in seeing what majors they do select when they go to college. So you might also do another study. Maybe these former students, we could follow up with these former students and learn about their decisions, as well as they feel if they gained any skills that are transferable. So maybe they didn't major in STEM, but maybe they learned something about inquiry. Another response may be considering a cost analysis. So maybe, is this program still worth it? Is it worth the resources we're putting into it? And then a question to follow up on, are there differences among middle school girls? So is there some patterns that we notice? Are certain middle school girls continuing on and others are not? So maybe if certain subgroups of that middle school girl population may feel more mentored or less mentored in STEM, maybe that influences their participation. So that's a couple of really great examples. I do see some people are typing. I'm going to go back to another example that is about a different finding, and then we'll come back to see what else you've put in the chat. So let's see if a different form of use could be improving the program. So now we're back in formative evaluation. We're not ready to shut the program down. We really want to improve it. What decisions might you make if you were to hear this finding? Teachers in the STEM partnership were able to build strong relationships with the university faculty and students, so those are the graduate students, but they weren't really able to build relationships with the STEM businesses and community members in the district as part of the partnership. So for example, hospitals and science museums. So if you interviewed teachers and they told you, yeah, we had great relationships with university faculty, we really appreciated those graduate students coming in and working with us, and helping us through designing our lessons. But we really didn't get a chance to work with the hospitals that much. We really didn't get out to the field to introduce our students into possible careers. How might you use this finding if you were a stakeholder in this evaluation? And specifically thinking about improvement, right? How might you improve the program? Are there more questions you would ask, more data you would collect, or some actions you might take? A response about asking teachers what supports they might need. So a follow-up question. So asking teachers, what do you need in order to be better connected to the business community? I think I would also ask the business community, did you know about this program? Did you know you could have students coming to your science museum under this program, and how could we help you better connect to it? Finding out who else at school can play this role. Not sure exactly what that means, but maybe if you can elaborate a little bit in the chat, that would be helpful. Play the role of connecting maybe, or play the role of getting the teachers out into the communities. Maybe one or two more ideas. How might we use this finding if you were a stakeholder in the evaluation? Oh, okay. The elaboration here is there someone, say the principal, who does outreach, make sure they have the info to share? So going back to the idea of maybe the right people are not making the right connections, so figuring out who those people are. And then Laura, considering reaching out to the local Chamber of Commerce, so trying to do some action. So some of these proposals here are questions, ways to find out more information. Others of these are actions that we might take as a result of this evaluation. So thanks for offering your ideas. We're going to move along now, and you can continue to participate in the main chat. And we'll talk about some logistics that are commonly considered when planning for an evaluation.
Thanks, Candice. I appreciate it, and that was a great chat. So here we're talking about the logistics of planning for an evaluation. And in a lot of instances, people always start with this, but just sort of a reminder on that is about, you start often thinking about the budget of what it's going to cost for an evaluation. And I said a lot of people start thinking about that, but not always. Sometimes people forget exactly what they're going to they get really excited about things, so they start thinking about the evaluation and not always the budget. So common evaluation budget items are actually personnel, and that could be including internal and third-party evaluation staff, or project managers or support staff, or any of those folks who might be working on the evaluation and sort of like who might be trying to maintain the data entry and management systems such as databases. So you really have to think about who all is going to be on the evaluation. And then the costs of data collection. A lot of times people forget about how much it actually costs to collect data, and this could include the costs of purchasing data collection instruments, mailings, respondent incentives. A lot of people who are thinking that they're going to use an online survey sometimes forget that they actually have to purchase an online survey platform and understand how that works as well. Also, they travel might include recruitment of study sites if you need them, or data collection such as airfare, mileage, lodging, per diem. Those are all aspects that you need to consider in an evaluation. And then training for the evaluation staff, as well as trying to think about software and data systems, including hardware and software costs. A lot of times people need extra hardware in terms of how they're going to collect data. If you're using, for instance, an iPad or an iPod or something of that nature to collect. And then finally, data security. How will you actually secure your data? Is there a cost to that? And trying to keep that data secure, you're also thinking about antivirus and anti-hacking software and encryption software. So all of that plays into the kind of items that you need to be considering in the budget for an evaluation. Generally, and we've said this before, generally evaluations go between, people will do between 10 to 15% overhead, and we're talking about 10 to 15% that they would allow of their budget for evaluation purposes. There's also the other aspect that you have to consider is the actual timeline. Some things might be how and what questions you answer with the resources available. If you have a limited amount of resources, it can put boundaries on the timeline, and you have to think about exactly how long it's going to take, and if you have that personnel for that long, if you have the data software for that long, all of that can play into that. And then when will the decisions be made about the program or the professional learning development? And another consideration is use. When do decisions get made, and what information do you need to make that you need to have beforehand before that happens? And then also in the timeline, we're also considering, are the evaluations questions formative or summative? And last year, evaluations questions can help you determine whether you're looking at a short-term or a long-term evaluation. So those evaluation questions that you ask are key. So if the program's just getting started, you're more likely to have a formative evaluation and have formative evaluation questions because you're really looking at the process or the implementation, and that might be a little bit shorter and a little less expensive to look at. You can start planning ahead for your summative evaluation questions, which tend to be about outcomes or impact, but you might not be able to collect this information until the program has been operating for some time. So you kind of have to think about the timing of when you want to collect information and what kind of information you can realistically give at different stages, such as the formative stage and the summative stage. So the other aspect that people really often consider, and we know that a lot of you have worked with an external evaluator, and the question is, do you need an external evaluator or can the work be done internally? A lot of times, sometimes people will say, well, listen, we have an internal evaluator, but we also need some external help as well. And what kind of relationship do you want with the evaluator? And just sort of thinking about some of those characteristics. Some of the characteristics would be, working with some of these evaluators externally. You can look at third-party evaluators. The benefits are bringing technical expertise into research methodology and statistics, so those folks can bring in that expertise that you may not have. Provide credibility and objectivity by acting as an external critical friend, so someone who gets you but also can sort of tell you the truth as well. And then also the third-party evaluators can also take on responsibility for completing some or all of the formative and summative evaluation tasks, so they can allow project staff to focus on project implementation and not so much in the evaluation. The limitations of that are that you have third-party evaluators. Sometimes they add unanticipated or additional costs to the project. It does cost money to bring in those folks. They add project monitoring and management tasks focused on the work of contractors, so that's something else you have to worry about as well in addition to implementing. And then they don't always know the project background and content area as well as the project staff, so you probably need to leave them a little bit of time to come up to speed, and they're not always as available or accessible as compared to project staff because they're not there, of course. So we have to sort of consider that aspect as well with working with an external evaluator. Some of the characteristics to look for if you're going to work with folks, and I think it really comes down to what makes you most comfortable and what your needs are in terms of working with an external evaluator. And when you decide to work with one, some of the characteristics you want to ask, and these are questions you want to go ahead and ask, are what's the knowledge of the topics important to the program? Do they have a working knowledge? They may not have everything specific to your program, but maybe you'd like them to have a little bit more information about if they're looking at professional learning programs, then maybe they should have been involved in that. In professional learning evaluation. Do they have technical competence for the data collection methods that you need or have decided to use? Do they have project management skills? Because this is a project. It's another project, not necessarily towards the implementation, but it is an evaluation project, and they're going to have to figure out about timelines and time management and deliverables and things of that nature. How do they communicate with stakeholders? Can they communicate with the myriad of stakeholders that you have, and in what ways they may be communicating with them? And that point, you want to ask about their writing and speaking skills. You also want to ask them about the flexibility that they have available and work that out. Do they have time for your project? And then finally, compatibility on levels of collaboration. You have to decide how much of a relationship do you want with your evaluator, and in what ways should you be working with them? If you're looking to be much more participatory, you probably want an evaluator who works in that way as well. And then also the evaluation approach is, are you looking for an outcome evaluation, and then your evaluator's looking for an impact? That's a little bit of a clash. So thinking a little bit about that aspect as well. So those are characteristics to ask for in an evaluator, and I like to say that people should be savvy consumers of who they choose to do an evaluation, and not just about how much money it is, but how they're going to work with you. So we have a poll here, and if you've had to work with an external evaluator, what consideration was most important to you? So we'll go ahead and then also use the chat that we have right next to it to tell us why. So we see a couple things. Everybody's looking for technical skills so far. Yep, definitely. Budget for a lot of folks, and then also, so those are the top two right now. Technical skills definitely comes up because a lot of times if you're implementing the program, it's hard to also get, be a technical guru at the same time as well. And Kim said that I need one that also includes prior experience. So that's true. You want to know exactly what people have been doing, and if that experience that they have matches what you need at this particular time. So thanks for that, Kim. Others, Hella says an evaluator with all these characteristics but not the technical skills cannot get the work done. I agree with you as well. It's great to have all these other skills, but if they don't have the technical skills, then it is sort of a moot point because you almost feel like you could do it yourself, and why call them? And Hella says, I can figure the other things out. That could very well be, and I think it's a personal thought, is if you feel like you've got the other part covered, the technical skills, that's a big deal. So knowing what you need is key. Again, that's why I say, when you're hiring an evaluator, be savvy about what it is that you need and what's most important to you. If you are the folks who actually are going to be, for instance, communicating to everyone, then maybe you don't need the evaluator who's going to be the great skilled communicator, but they're not so great at the survey that you wanted them to do. So Deborah says that she doesn't know if this falls under technical skills, but she says she also looks for good writing skills. She says she needs a good, readable final product. Amen to that. It's hard because that, after the evaluator's gone, it's the report that still stands. So that is that's a big deal. And Candice says, amen to that as well. Good point. If you can't read the final product, it won't be used. So that's what it really comes down to. So again, our two pieces there that are budget and technical skills. And someone on the other side just said, you always need somebody who can translate from researcher jargon to plain English. And then I'm going to take this final comment from Hella, which is, in some cases, she specifically don't want them to have a relationship with the community so that they're seen as an objective outsider. That's true. There's a lot of folks who do that. They say, well, listen, we know that everybody has a stake in this. In what ways, we want somebody from the outside to tell us, what it really has meaning, and what we need to be looking for. So thank you for all of those comments. Really helpful on that poll as well. And so I am going to move it to Candice, who will bring us to the discussion and application.
Yes, so we are just going to end here with some discussion and application to your own work, and we really would love to hear from you at this point. What's resonating with you? How does this relate to the work that you're doing, and also what questions you have so that we can address those questions toward the end of our webinar today. So we'd just like to prompt a little bit of your work to hear from you. If you worked with an evaluator or conducted an evaluation of your own, what have you done to ensure that this process was successful? What are some stories of your work and some successes that you might have had in doing evaluation? So I've heard a couple of things that you can infer from the previous discussion. One of them is you want to make sure you have somebody who has the technical skills to be able to do the work that you are looking for. And I was curious about what technical skills people were looking for. And I know it varies by what evaluation you're doing, but I was just really more curious if people were looking for people who can collect qualitative data or quantitative data. Are people out there really looking for somebody who can run some statistical models, or are people really looking for somebody who is a really skilled facilitator of focus groups because they want to hear from teachers or hear from principals? So that was my question earlier, just about technical skills. So what have you done to ensure that the process was successful? So Hella is saying the stakeholders and the evaluators co-designed the evaluation. So that's interesting because I think we've put both sides of the continuum of stakeholder involvement on the table. One is you can ensure the evaluation becomes more successful by involving some key stakeholders and by making sure that you have relationships with those stakeholders and that they see themselves in the evaluation. And then we've also talked earlier about maybe the evaluator wanting to maintain some distance. I know that you can involve stakeholders and still maintain distance, but those are choices that you have to think about the trade-offs and how you might do that. Kim is talking about wanting somebody skilled at creating measurable goals and objectives and designing methods to measure them. So earlier in this webinar series, we talked about the importance of logic modeling and getting people to the table to create that logic model, to understand what their goals and objectives are, and then have a way to generate the indicators and the data that are going to measure them. Deb is talking about wanting specific timelines and touch points throughout the project. Sure, so project management skills, as Katrina mentioned earlier, setting those up ahead of time and making sure that you communicate those clearly with your evaluator. And then regarding technical skills, she typically wants advice regarding a combination of qualitative and quantitative and what their suggestions are about the best way to do the work. So yeah, thanks for sharing some of those experiences with us. Sounds like people have some experience working on evaluation from various perspectives. Now is the time when we just like to open the floor for any questions that you have. If you've been with us over the last 3 webinars, you can ask questions about content that maybe you've heard from any of those webinars or anything that's still lingering, in addition to any questions that have come up based on what you have heard from us today. We haven't seen a lot of questions in the chat, so if you have anything that's on your mind or something you'd like to discuss, we'd love to hear it. Or if you have a dilemma, maybe something that you're wrestling with from your own work, either in evaluation or hiring an evaluator yourself, or doing the evaluation, let us know. Maybe while people are thinking, Katrina, do you have any questions that people sometimes ask you when you're doing evaluations? Clients who haven't done a lot of evaluation?
Yeah,
that come up?
It is. Usually people, they ask, sometimes they'll ask how much it costs, and then they sometimes are sort of like a little bit surprised at how much that it might cost. That's one. The other aspect that people ask is, how long will be involved with one another. So getting back to that relationship piece as well is like, well, how long will you be there, and and how involved I'll be if I'm going to be at some of the events. So folks will ask those questions. And then sometimes they do ask technical questions, particularly if people have been told that they need to use a particular design, but they're unsure if that works. Given what they've been told, they'll say, oh, I thought they told me I'm supposed to use a randomized controlled trial, and then as you continue to talk, you realize that, well, maybe that's not going to work, and they say, we were thinking that, but they told us that's what we should do. So those are some of the questions that I've definitely gotten from folks. So it's always there. What I'd like to hear more, one question I would love to hear more about is your communication skills, writing and communication. I would love to hear more about like how do you write and how do you speak. So those are 2. Candice?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. I think one question that comes up sometimes for people as they approach evaluation is, when do I start thinking about evaluation? And a mistake that some people often make is they don't really start thinking about evaluation until the program is off and running, or the program's been in operation for quite some time, and then they start to think, oh, I might need to document some evidence of my impact here. I might need to document evidence of the effect that I'm having with this program. And because they haven't really planned for evaluation, they may not have been collecting data all along the way that could have been really useful at the beginning. They might not be able to say that they have results from each year of the program because they don't have certain data, or they don't have baseline data. They don't have data from the start of the program, so they can't make any claims about what has changed, because now they're starting to collect data from the end of the program without being able to compare it to anything in the beginning. So I think just a point of advice, and the reason we spend a lot of time on this webinar talking about the entire cycle, is you really want to plan from the beginning of a program. As you're first starting up, as you are thinking about your program model, that logic model, you want to be able to have evaluation in mind all the way along so that you can avoid some of those pitfalls. Any other questions? I don't see any others in the chat. Katrina, anything else you want to add before we move along here?
Nope, that's great.
Okay. So as we're coming around to the end of our webinar today, we also want to remind you, or we want to let you know, that we'd love to hear from you about what you've learned, how you will use it in your work. This is useful for us. It's good evidence for us, going back to the need to have data. It's good data for us to see what you're coming away with, what takeaways you have from today's webinar. So please let us know in the chat how you might use what you've learned in something that you do in your work. Go ahead and put that in as we talk about the conclusion and the next steps. And so for that, I'll turn it over to Katrina.
Great. Thank you, Candice. So we look forward to hearing how you're going to be using that. So just as we conclude this webinar, one of the things we really just wanted to remind people that what we've talked about today is about data analysis and reporting, and also just, trying to make the distinction between data analysis and actual reporting and data collection. And then also we talked about evaluation, dissemination, and use. And in terms of trying to think about what we want to get across to our audiences. And then we also talked about the logistics of planning and evaluation and how that works, and being the savvy consumer of evaluators. So that's what we've been talking about today, and also just sort of rounding out and letting you know that we've hit the entire continuous evaluation model, which started out with defining, which is the purpose of the evaluation and the underlying logic of the program. Step 2, which is planning and what questions and design that you want to look at, and then implementation, how you're going to collect the data, and then finally 4th, interpretation, which is what are the results and how should they be communicated, and then finally step 5, which is inform or refine, what decisions can you make with the data that you have. And we note that this is a continuous evaluation model that we sort of say that it does not necessarily stop. You continuously use it to refine and to provide information as you need it. So our next steps for this ends our webinar series of 3. And our next steps are to, if you get an opportunity, to revisit the webinar series with session 1 and session 2. And these will be located within the resources. Refer to the references in all of the sessions. We have those on the slides and within the webinar. And also contact REL Northeast Islands for resources and questions. Please do, and if you have resources that you'd like to add, please do as well. Let us know. And then contact Candice and I for more information. We're happy to respond and chat with folks, and then just have an opportunity to share information. So if you want to contact us, you can contact Candice. As her email is there, and you can contact myself. And then we also encourage you to visit the REL Northeast Islands website, which you see there. So thank you so much for today, and we really appreciate the time that you spent with us and your comments, and we hope to hear from you. Candice?
Hi, this is Ashley Gaddis again, the Dissemination Manager at REL Northeast Islands. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today and for participating in this 3-part webinar series. As I said earlier, today's webinar recording will be archived and uploaded to the IES YouTube channel. The recordings of the previous 2 webinars are already there, as you just saw. And if you registered for today's webinar, you will receive an email from us with a link to the final recording when it is ready. Additionally, please don't forget to download the handouts and slides from today's presentation, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.